Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Xile. Sorry, it has been a while. Life has been pretty busy lately. Today we are going to discuss the imminent US invasion of Venezuela. And yes, I do mean an invasion. I think it's pretty obvious to everyone at this point that, some sort of military action is going to happen. But I think most people assume it's going to be, a blockade or a bombing run or something like that. And I'm here to tell you that no, we are doing a full boots on the ground regime change Iraq style invasion of Venezuela. Let's jump right into it. All right, so first we'll discuss what exactly I'm going to be going over in this video. I'm going to start with a brief history of Venezuela because I think most people's knowledge, maybe goes back to Maduro or Hugo Chavez, but not anything before that. So I think it's important that we establish some groundwork before we discuss what's happening in the current day. Then we're going to talk about the alleged reason why we're doing all of this, the drug trade. Of course, it's complete bullshit, but we'll discuss that when we get to it. Then we'll look at the real reasons, of which there are a few. Oil, the Monroe Doctrine, Marco Rubio, and a personal beef, which I'll elaborate more on when we get there. Then we'll talk about the actual military movements that have happened, including military deployments, and all of the oil tankers that have now been seized, and all of the boats that have been blown up. There's actually been a lot of movement on that front fairly recently. And then we'll end this video with my sort of long to medium term predictions about what will happen with this war and why ultimately a US regime change / occupation will fail. Alright, so let's get started with our history lesson. I'm not going to go back to the 1800s and Simón Bolívar and the rebellion against Spain and all that. We're going to start our story in the 1960s. So, as you all hopefully know, during the 1960s was the peak of the Cold War. All of geopolitics revolved around this, United States versus Soviet Union dichotomy. And even though the government of Venezuela was left-wing, and even though they nationalized portions of the oil industry, Venezuela was on relatively good terms with America, especially when compared to today. Then in 1973, the Yom Kippur War starts in Israel and the surrounding Middle Eastern countries. And because the United States supported Israel during this conflict, Iran and Saudi Arabia and I think a bunch of other Middle Eastern countries boycotted, or it was OPEC. OPEC boycotted the United States and many of its allies. And this caused a massive surge in the price of oil. And as you know, Venezuela relies very heavily on its oil industry and on oil exports. But then, in 1989, the North Sea oil field in modern-day Norway led to a fall in the price of oil throughout the 80s. And by 1989, Venezuela was $30 billion in debt. And the IMF, as they do, said, hey, we'll bail you out, but you got to have cuts to your social safety programs. So Venezuela at this time had extensive socialist programs, free food, healthcare, housing, the works, right? And it worked for a long time, as long as the price of oil was high enough to pay for all of these things. But when the price of oil crashed, the government could no longer pay for these things, and it caused a lot of people to slip back into poverty. So in 1999, this guy named Hugo Chavez, he's elected president. He promises to fix the problems with the country, as you do when you're a populist aspiring dictator. In the 2000s, Chavez successfully centralizes power around himself and around his cult of personality. He appoints his cronies to the board of PDVSA. PDVSA is the National Venezuelan Oil Company. Okay, they're the ones that control all of the oil and all of the oil revenue within Venezuela. And it used to be relatively independent from the central Venezuelan government, from Caracas, but Hugo Chavez changed all that, and he appointed people based on loyalty to himself instead of, competence. In 2008, the 2008 financial crisis caused a slowdown of global demand, which caused another crash in the price of oil, which caused another round of economic chaos. Chavez was not feeling very well. He was pretty sick. So his right-hand man, this guy named Maduro, who was a former bus driver, that was his qualification, steps up and takes the reins. By 2017, democracy in Venezuela was truly finished. Hugo Chavez, despite censoring the media and doing all of these democratic things, never went full dictator, right? He was still beholden to some external powers. By 2017, this was no longer the case for Maduro. He gutted the National Assembly and essentially replaced the National Assembly with a different legislative body that wasn't called the National Assembly, but was basically a National Assembly, except for it was full of people that were loyal to him. Amazing. And he also basically stripped the Supreme Court of their powers to check his power. And then in 2019, there was this weird situation where this guy named Juan Guaido was elected, air quotes, president. And internationally, everyone just pretended this guy was the president of Venezuela, even though he was just some guy that the West was propping up. We'll get more into that later when we talk about the new Juan Guaido. They have a new face to this strategy this time around. So, there's a couple key takeaways from this slide. First of all, Venezuela did not collapse because socialism. Okay, this is a very common right-wing argument. I've heard everyone from Ben Shapiro to Steven Crowder to Fox News to whoever always make this case. No, Venezuela was socialist for like triple my lifespan. Okay, it's only in the past, 10, 15 years that things really started to go downhill. Socialism did not cause Venezuela to collapse. What caused Venezuela to collapse was that they put a guy in power who knew nothing about economics. He massively destroyed the productive capacity of the oil industry in Venezuela, which caused oil revenue to dry up. And instead of reining him in, every democratic safeguarded institution in the country basically just kept ceding ground to him and giving him unchecked power. Does any of that sound familiar? The other thing I want to get across on this slide is that I am going to be very critical of the United States and their recent actions throughout this video. But I want to be very clear, I am not defending Maduro, I am not defending Hugo Chavez, I am not defending Venezuela. Hugo Chavez is easily one of the worst dictators, one of the worst, most evil, corrupt world leaders that exists right now today. We have the people of Venezuela are suffering from North Korea levels of famine. They're eating food out of garbage. He's not a good leader. He is a selfish, cruel, evil, small man. So no matter what I say about Trump or, the actions the United States is taking against him, know that this is in no way a defense of Maduro or his policies. All right, so now let's discuss the casus belli, the so-called cause for war, the justification for war. Ostensibly, it is the drug trade, but there's a couple problems with this. Okay, first of all, only 10% of all cocaine traffic to the United States actually passes through Venezuela. The vast majority of it either goes through the Central American land route, up through Panama, Honduras, Guatemala, and then Mexico, or, more likely, it goes by sea, but on the Pacific side, okay? So it goes up the Pacific coast, which is a much shorter distance and much more navigable. So, yeah. Another problem is that exactly zero fentanyl, which is, besides cocaine, another cited reason for this, military actions against Venezuela. Exactly zero fentanyl is produced inside Venezuela. Almost all the fentanyl consumed in the United States either comes from Mexico or the United States itself. Okay, so that is just BS. This whole fentanyl business. Also, the majority of these boats that are being targeted by these missiles and blown up in the ocean simply don't have the gasoline or motor capacity to reach the U.S. It is physically impossible for them to make it across the Caribbean Sea and get to the United States. All right, they just don't have. These are not yachts we're talking about. These are not cargo ships. These are tiny little dinghies, and it is just physically impossible for them to make it all the way on the large multi-day journey that would be necessary to cross the entire Caribbean Ocean to get to America. Additionally, the government has provided exactly zero evidence that any of these people they've murdered are actually drug traffickers. And in fact, the governments of both Colombia and Venezuela have provided, the names of many of these people and have shown evidence that they were fishermen. That doesn't go for all the people that have died, but it does go for some of them. That being said, because the main drug trafficking route is through the Pacific, not the Atlantic, it is more believable that the strikes conducted in the Pacific, which there are fewer of, but there are still some, were actually targeting the drug traffickers. That is semi-believable, as opposed to them just striking random boats in the Atlantic and saying they're drug traffickers. Yeah, I call bullshit. According to both Lindsey Graham and now Trump, the targets for ground invasion and military action have expanded to Colombia. And if the real reason for this, military action was the drug trade, Colombia would be the number one target, right? Because they manufacture and distribute the vast majority of cocaine globally, really. So the fact that Colombia wasn't like the first target is just more proof that this has nothing to do with drugs. Additionally, you'll hear Trump throw out this whole cartel of the suns thing. It is entirely possible that this whole cartel of the suns thing is a complete fabrication. Basically, the American justice system, or the Department of Justice, created this cartel of the suns, like fabricated it, and just to be able to pin the blame for narcotics trafficking on high-ranking Venezuelan officials. There was one high-ranking Venezuelan official, I believe he was a general, that was indicted for drug trafficking back in 2016. But as far as I know, nobody from the current Maduro regime has any provable links to any drug cartel organizations. This is I also have an issue with the designation of narco-terrorist. What the hell is a narco-terrorist? It doesn't make any sense. Like, they're committing suicide bombings in the name of drugs. Like, seriously, what is a narco-terrorist? It's undefinable. It's just whatever Trump says it is. He basically just made up this term narco-terrorist to be able to justify killing these civilians because they're quote-unquote terrorists. It's a total psyop, basically. Yeah. And also recently, speaking of, shifting the meaning and the definition of words, now fentanyl is considered a weapon of mass destruction by the Trump administration. Wow, where have I heard that before? A country possessing weapons of mass destruction that leads to a justification for the United States to intervene militarily? Sounds awfully familiar. Alright, now let's get to the actual reasons why we're doing all this. The first and most obvious, the one that everyone's been probably screaming at their screen since this video started, is oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves of any country on Earth. If you look at this table on the left, these are all the estimates by the different agencies for how many millions of barrels of oil that they have. You'll also notice that even though they have the largest amount, they have the lowest oil production, and that's again because Maduro is an idiot. He knows nothing about economics and has mismanaged the Venezuelan oil sector horribly. Okay, the biggest problem with this oil is that it is very low quality. It's basically like oil mixed with like sand, and it's actually kind of a pain in the ass to refine. But the best place to refine it is in America, specifically on the southern coast of Texas and Louisiana. It used to be big business. We would import oil from Venezuela, refine it, and then sell the products to the rest of the world. It was very profitable. Trump has declared now that the U.S. will get back the oil Venezuela, quote-unquote, stole. He also said we would take back our land and our assets. I don't know what the hell he's talking about with the land stuff. Whatever. What he means here is that, Venezuela at a certain point had some deals with ExxonMobil, that ExxonMobil would provide them equipment, and technology and personnel, and in exchange, ExxonMobil would get a cut of the profit. But then I think during the Hugo Chavez era of Venezuela, that deal was reneged on, and those oil partnerships were all nationalized and placed under the purview of PDVSA. So yeah, he's just straightforwardly saying, like, we're doing this to steal your oil. Fantastic. The other oft-cited reason is this little thing called the Monroe Doctrine. So what is the Monroe Doctrine? It is named after the 5th President of the United States, the often forgotten James Monroe. And what the Monroe Doctrine says, in so many words, is that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence. Or specifically, the Monroe Doctrine talked about the European powers and how after the independence of Venezuela and Gran Colombia and all those other Central and South American nations, that the Europeans should no longer interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, and that the U.S. would militarily basically guarantee or protect any foreign intervention in the Western Hemisphere. Of course, over time, this evolved into a pro-interventionist stance where basically the United States would intervene to make sure every country in the Western Hemisphere and Central and South America was, in fact, in America's sphere of influence proactively. Of course, we failed in a couple key areas, namely Cuba, and nowadays Venezuela is building very close ties with Iran and Russia especially, and geopolitically the US does not like that because Iran and to a certain extent Russia are big number one enemies of this current administration and most other US administrations. They don't want another Cuba situation where this hostile nation is relatively close to the United States. Back in the good old days, in the Cold War days, we would have couped Venezuela already. We did this in so many South American countries, in Guatemala and Chile, and the list goes on and on and on. But yeah, we're trying to repeat that kind of Cold War style intervention to sway the Venezuelan state back into America's sphere of influence and away from the China, Iran, Russia axis. One of the main reasons this is happening is because we are transitioning from a unipolar world where the US is the top dog and everyone has to play by our rules to a multipolar world where we're seeing the rise of powers such as China or the European Union or India or hell, maybe even Brazil if they get their shit together. And this transition process is never a smooth, A to B line. There's always stumbling blocks on the road. And this is basically us trying to reassert our dominance and prove to everyone that we are still a big boy and can do big boy things and act on the world stage. It's kind of similar to what Russia is hoping to accomplish with their invasion of Ukraine. They're trying to show the world that Russia's strong, they can still throw their weight around. There's still power to be respected. Some of that is also guiding U.S. foreign policy in this instance. And then we get to Mr. Marco Rubio. Marco Rubio is this guy pictured here, obviously, and he is the acting Secretary of State, which means he's in charge of all foreign affairs. That is his domain. That is his realm of political control. He was born to Cuban exiles who fled Cuba during the Cuban Revolution when Castro came to power. The Cuban exile community are mainly based in southern Florida, and they are very peculiar politically. They're very conservative because they view Castro and his left-wing government as the ultimate boogeyman, the ultimate evil. So basically, Marco Rubio is pushing for war with Venezuela because Cuba was socialist and Venezuela is socialist, and to these Cuban exiles, socialism is like the boogeyman that their parents would tell them in like their bedtime stories as they were falling asleep. Now that seems a little childish and immature to translate, your parents' insecurities into your own foreign policy, but that's the reality of the world we live in. They're basically drumming up Cold War era Red Scare tactics to try and justify this war. And then we get to how Trump specifically is driving us closer to war with Venezuela. So first of all, there was a recent interview released from the chief of staff of Trump, Susie Wiles, and she admits that regime change is indeed the primary motivation. So we actually have an inside source confirming a lot of the things that I've laid out in this video. Also, this whole coup, get rid of Maduro, they already tried to do that in Trump's first term with Juan Guaido. They said that this man, Juan Guaido, legitimately won the presidential election, even though that is almost certainly not the case. And they were trying to get everyone else to treat him as the acting president, even though he held no actual power and was basically just a figurehead. Again, we have a new lady to serve as our Juan Guaido to replace Maduro when we do this coup. We'll talk more about her at the end of the video. There's also an interesting phenomenon happening because Trump and Maduro are similar in a lot of ways. They're both post-truth populist authoritarians. So what's happening is Trump is using the threat of Venezuela to justify military action and authoritarianism, and Maduro is using U.S. aggression and sanctions and such as justification for his authoritarianism and military action. It's like a cycle. Like they're both symbiotically feeding into each other's delusions and allowing them to tighten their grip over their country and over their populace. In Maduro's case, obviously U.S. sanctions are hurting the country, and especially now the actions that we're taking where we're blowing up boats and blockading them and seizing oil tankers. But a large part of the economic chaos is most certainly his fault. And then as far as from the Trump perspective, Maduro poses very little actual threat to anybody in the United States, but why let that get in the way of some nice showboating? And then the final reason this personally relates to Trump is about the Epstein files, which actually were just released by the Department of Justice today, or yesterday, I think. This is all a very nice distraction from the Epstein files. Everybody knows Trump is all over the Epstein files, even though they did their best to redact it and try and take him out of it. Every time the Epstein files is brought up, it's politically damaging to Trump, and he would rather everybody ignore it and move on to the next thing. And if people won't move on to the next thing, well, you have to create the next thing. You have to seize the spotlight and overpower this narrative with a narrative of your own. And war is very flashy and looks good on TV cameras, so what better way to do that than with an actual hot war? Now let's get into what has actually occurred in the past couple of months. So starting in September, the United States has struck 28 boats, killing a total of over 100 people. And these strikes have mainly been conducted using missiles. Like I said earlier, there's no evidence that any of these people targeted or killed were drug traffickers, although if they were going through the Pacific route, then, they might have been. And even if they were drug traffickers, the punishment for drug trafficking is not vaporization. They should be arrested and hauled to court. You do not get to extrajudicially assassinate people. Obviously, it's a violation of international law and a war crime, but whatever. Most of the boats struck are from Venezuela, but there were, I believe, 3 from Colombia and 1 from Trinidad and Tobago. In October, Trump made an announcement that he has authorized the CIA and the military to consider striking land targets in Colombia and Venezuela, and that would be done with aircraft. So when the invasion does happen, they'll have free reign to do whatever they need to do on that front. And then most recently, as in like the past week, 3 Venezuelan oil tankers have been seized. So the U.S. is now engaging in acts of piracy. Awesome. Then we have the actual troop deployments. So they've deployed an entire carrier strike group, which includes the USS Gerald Ford, which is the largest aircraft carrier in the world. There are an accompaniment of other ships, including a nuclear attack submarine. There are about 20,000 Marines stationed in the area, ready to go, ready to hit the beaches. The Venezuelan army sits at about 120,000, and Maduro claims there are millions of people in reserve, although that's doubtful. And it's quite likely that the Venezuelan army is very undersupplied in terms of basic supplies like food and ammunition, so it's very likely that they will not be able to. I think this is the reason why they didn't jump on Guyana a year ago. If you remember, that was like a whole big thing that they were going to invade Guyana. I think the main reason they didn't is because they simply don't have enough food to feed their troops, and starving troops make for very poor assault units. Pete Hegseth announced Operation Southern Spear, insert dick joke here, which, lays out all the supposed goals, stopping the narco-terrorists, etc., etc. It was a bunch of hogwash, but basically he's just saying, yes, this is a real military operation now. We're, getting serious with it. And then another very recent development that happened is that we are now blockading Venezuela and all sanctioned oil tankers. So no oil tankers from Venezuela are allowed to leave, and no oil tankers are allowed to come in. This is a huge deal because even though Maduro, again, has completely gutted the oil sector, it is still the primary source of revenue for the government and still the main economic engine. And so by cutting off the oil, by saying you can no longer sell your oil, it will destroy Venezuela's economy even more than it has already been destroyed, and could actually lead to mass starvation. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that happened. So he's essentially, with this move is designed to force Maduro's hand and have him either step down or take some sort of drastic action. All right, now let's talk about what I actually think will happen when this war comes. By the way, I think this war will probably happen within the next 3 months. I doubt we will reach the summer and things will still be in this sort of striking the boats phase. I think we'll be in full kinetic ground invasion by then. America is traditionally very good at fighting conventional wars. Think World War II, think the Korean War, think the first Persian Gulf War. However, where we struggle is with guerrilla warfare. Think Vietnam, think Afghanistan. So the thing about an invasion of Venezuela is that Caracas and the coastline, that can be captured, that can be occupied, right? The United States Navy is obviously much, much stronger than the Venezuelan Navy. We can easily seize the port towns and the coast, and it's only a short march from the coast to the capital. The real problem, though, is that there is a vast inland mountainous jungle inside the interior of Venezuela. Very similar terrain to Vietnam, actually, and we all know how that went. So, unless we somehow get the unconditional support of the vast majority of the population of Venezuela, which is very unlikely because Maduro has been propagandizing to his population for the past, decade or two, that everything wrong with their country is the U.S.'s fault. So, and for other reasons we'll discuss later, it's very unlikely that, the people of Venezuela are going to get down on their hands and knees and thank America for invading their country. It didn't happen in Iraq. I don't think it'll happen now. Basically, a protracted guerrilla warfare in the interior is inevitable, and the United States sucks at fighting those types of wars. When these strikes first began, a high-ranking admiral, the head admiral of all of the U.S. Southern Command, resigned because he knew these strikes were illegal, and he knew that the road that the Trump administration was going down was going to end in disaster, and he did not want his name attached to that. Friend of the channel, Pete Hegseth, I don't know why it says that, does not have my confidence. He's an alcoholic. He's a Fox News host. He doesn't know anything about the military. He gave this super embarrassing speech last month, or maybe it was 2 months ago, where he got up in front of all the West Point generals and started saying how they all need to do push-ups and stuff. It was a travesty. You want to hear my Pete Hegseth impression? Look at me, mommy. I'm a big, powerful general man. All the big men in the room respect me. Do you love me, mommy? Are you proud of me? Are you proud of me? Yeah. He's basically a little kid who just wants everyone's thumbs up. It's pathetic. Um, Again, just because the population of Venezuela is very radicalized against Maduro and the Maduro regime does not mean that they will love a foreign invader. This is a very flawed theory. I don't know exactly who was pushing this in the Iraq War days, but it was always bullshit to begin with, okay? And finally, we already have our chosen puppet replacement. And it is this woman pictured in the top right, Maria Machado. Roll the clip of Maria Machado.
Maria, again, this is the Nobel Peace Prize winner who has done nothing for the nation of Venezuela except say, don't you worry, guys, one day America will invade and I'll lead once they do. Did a Rumble stream with Don Jr., Nobel Peace Prize, triggered with Donald Trump Jr.
Forget about Saudi Arabia. Forget about the Saudis. I mean, we have more oil. I mean, infinite potential. And we're going to open markets. We're going to kick off the government from the oil sector. We are going to privatize all our industries. Venezuela has huge resources: oil, gas, minerals, land, technology. And as you said before, we have a strategic location, hours from the United States. So
she did prove the election was rigged. Doug, Maduro was right to bar her from the election. She's literally a national traitor. Like this is insane. This would be like letting the Soviets like running a Politburo elections, and John CIA is like getting a bunch of suspicious money and support. Like, what? This is crazy. It was completely correct.
We're going to do this right. We know what we have to do. And American companies are in, super strategic position to invest. This country, Venezuela, is going to be the brightest opportunity for investment of American companies.
Jesus Christ, you don't have to be this straightforward about it, man.
So yeah, as you can see, that is not a great look to go on the son of the president's podcast and say basically, yeah, we're going to sell out the entire country to U.S. corporate interests. I doubt this will endear her to the Venezuelan public. So that's that. We'll get involved in this war. It'll be a years-long quagmire, just like Afghanistan was, and it will go down as one of the most damaging legacies of the Trump administration. Is this another forever war? The president for peace is engaging in another forever war. Surprise, surprise. But with that, I'm going to leave y'all to it. Comment down below if you want me to talk about the Epstein files. That's been the new big thing in the news these past couple days, and I can make a video on it if there is enough interest. I'm still working on Why Trump Won Part 4. It's the biggest video I've ever made. It's taking forever. Hopefully that will come out eventually. I've been making shorter form content because it's easier and there's just been a lot happening, but I will get back to my longer form, highly edited, highly produced stuff soon. Okay, thanks for watching. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Share this video if you want to spread the word. And also, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Saturnalia, Happy Hanukkah, etc., etc. Catch y'all on the flip side.